Okay, we'll now go to the next panel. Sharmini Peries is hosting Debating Socialist Strategy Post-Pandemic. Welcome, Sharmini.
Thank you. Thank you. What a panel I have. So like the other panels, this panel is much, I should say, unlike the other panels. This one has 2 additional people. So we have 5 panelists speaking. So that just means that we will have to be a bit more swift because we allocated the same time as the previous panel. So first of all, greetings from Toronto. I'm actually in the very neighborhood that Leo once lived. You know, his family still lives here. In fact, his son and I share backyards together. So, so I feel as if Leo's all around me all the time, and I do run into Melanie from time to time, strolling her new grandchild around. So it's really a pleasure to be here, to not only to remember Leo, but also to debate the socialist strategies and discuss beyond the socialist impasse with all of you. As you know, I, like many of you, were very close to Leo. In fact, through his camaraderie, his big-heartedness, he kept us all very close to him and quite networked with each other. And we all benefited from that. And that is why we are all here today. And a couple of fond memories I have, I want to share with you before we dive into the political issues at hand. And they are just how much fun Leo was. I know Francis alluded to this and others, but he was just a fun person to be around, no matter where we met up, you know, whether it was Venezuela, Brazil, South Africa, Greece, or right here in this neighborhood in Toronto. He was just fun to be with. We were good friends, we were comrades, we were neighbors, as I just said, but most importantly, as a young socialist at York University as a student, this is where I formed my worldview. And largely because of the colloquiums, the forums, the socialist gatherings, the parties, the conferences around the Socialist Register that Leo organized along with his close comrades, you know, Greg and Sam and others. These educational forums that was created politicized me. It is why I am the person I am today as an international socialist. One other interesting reference is that in the middle of my PhD at York University, I was tapped, luckily, I was given this opportunity by President Hugo Chavez of Venezuela to come and work with him at Miraflores on economic and foreign policy. Quite intrigued by the proposition because I had just gone to Venezuela to do an interview with him about what was going on there as a journalist. But he asked me to stay. He needed the support and the international support of the people that were thinking from the left to come and work with him. So quite intrigued by the offer, quite nervous about the offer. One of my very first calls was to Leo. And one can imagine how Leo answered the situation, but he, in his big voice, he said, "Sharmini, the PhD can wait. You can do that anytime," he said. "Engage in a revolution at this level, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity," he said. So he's urged me to seize the moment, the opportunity to promote a revolutionary socialist agenda from Venezuela, but that could be projected to the world stage. So he was so right. I did the right thing. So he advised and provided his counsel at critical times in my life. And then my last and very interesting engagements with Leo were as a journalist. I mean, there wasn't an issue that I couldn't call him up and ask him to help me understand, or a briefing, particularly in the economic and political fronts. So, but something very interesting about Leo was, if you asked Leo for an interview or to come on as a guest on a panel as a journalist, he rarely refused. And what I learned from this, what I took away from it, is that not that he was a media hog and he wanted to speak, which he enjoyed doing, but he didn't want to give up an opportunity to educate the masses, to educate the people that this medium would reach. So I was always strapped for a guest, would be able to call on him. He had something to say about what was going on in the world. He was one of the most well-read people I knew about current affairs. But if he couldn't speak to it because he hadn't thought about it enough, or he didn't consider it his expertise, he would quickly give me 4 or 5 other people who would speak to this issue, and their contacts. And, he really facilitated the movement in a way that I don't see a lot of people out there doing, as Francis Fox Piven spoke to earlier about how generous he was in sharing. So, with that in mind, and there's a lot more I could share with you about Leo and the way he helped, various, not only Syriza, but the Venezuelan leadership and other struggles in Latin America. But we have a very well informed panel, and without further ado, I'm going to actually introduce them 2 at a time, because by the time we get to the speakers, you would have forgotten. I'm sure all of these people are known to you, but surely their credentials might be forgotten by the time we get to them. So let me start off by introducing our first panelist, Sam Gindin. He is a retired research director of the Canadian Auto Workers and co-author, along with Leo, of the very famous book we all have on our shelves, The Making of Global Capitalism, The Political Economy of American Empire. And the second speaker, who will be Barbara Epstein. She's Professor Emerita at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and author of Political Protest and Cultural Revolution, Nonviolent Direct Action in the 1970s and 1980s, and a second book, The Minsk Ghetto, 1941 to 1943, Jewish Resistance and Soviet Internationalism. So let me start off by giving you the floor, Sam, so you can frame this conversation. You're muted, Sam.
Sorry. Okay. You can hear me now.
That's good.
Thanks, Sharmini. And just the reference to The Making of Global Capitalism, I should say I'm always using it. And right now it's propping up my computer screen so you can see me better. I hope people saw the clip of Leo at the beginning. If you missed it, you should go back and see it. It really captured his dynamism. It was Leo in full flight. And it really showed the unique ability of Leo to be inspiring, even when he was talking about defeats. And I really appreciated, and this always happens, the consistency of everyone who saw him both intellectually and an exemplary human being. And as Francis said, the connection between the two. Leo's intellectual genius was in painting a larger picture, then coming down to the concrete strategic possibilities of the place and the moment. And it's in that spirit that I really want to just think out loud about some issues surrounding the current moment that I've been wrestling with. And they especially revolve around the question of the working class. I should say that in spite of the debates that Leo and I had amongst ourselves, I can no longer tell which ideas are mine and which are Leo's. What distinguished Marxist socialism from the utopians was that he looked to the dynamics and contradictions of capitalism to find a social agency that might make socialism. He wasn't interested in just blueprints. He essentially politicized utopia. The agency that he discovered and argued for was the working class. Though it would certainly resist and struggle for reform, that was, however, distinct from it spontaneously becoming socialist. In fact, although we talk about all the external defeats that impacted on the present working class and the negative role of social democracy, we have to also address the limits and the contradictions in terms of their daily experience under capitalism. As someone, I think, said in the earlier panel, they are very much shaped, if not in the image of the bourgeoisie, but in the image of the kind of working class the bourgeoisie wanted. And they were shaped both by structural factors and sometimes quite consciously through the state. In terms of their daily experiences, their everyday experience taught them their dependency on the employer. Their everyday experience was about the fragmentation, that they were fragmented. They weren't a coherent class, as Aaron really emphasized. And that was along all kinds of dimensions, inside the workplace, working conditions, wages, but also outside. They faced constant survival pressures. They still do, short-term, which push them in a short-term and pragmatic direction. They're often exhausted. And when they daydream, it's usually to sustain themselves rather than about the possibilities of making a new world. And even when they had successes, very real successes, historically, these were often also integrative rather than a step in a revolutionary direction. Winning the vote at the end of the 19th centuries also led to identification with the state. It led to the nationalism that we saw in the First World War, and it led to electoralism as a vehicle for improving their lives. Unionization was a crucial victory, but it also meant fragmented, private, particularist battles with their own employers, not in class struggles. The welfare state, the achievements in the welfare state after the Second World War introduced very important reforms, but those reforms were about protecting them against the extremes of restructuring and about legitimating capitalism, but not about decommodifying their lives. It eased some of that commodification, but it was really channeling workers, channeling their militancy into individual consumerism. And the welfare state supplemented that rather than challenged it. This led to the dilemma that engaged Leo, but I really say haunted Leo his whole life. Can such a working class become socialist without the intervention of a mass socialist party? But also, how do you get a mass socialist party emerging when you have a working class with all these contradictions inside of it? How does this happen without socialists inside the working class? And this is, I think, what we're struggling with right now. So I want to fast forward to this particular moment and think about, well, what are some steps forward at this moment in time? The Sanders and Corbyn experiences in England and the US revealed exciting potentials. It showed that there were mass frustrations. It showed that there was the delegitimation of the existing order. When I was emerging as a socialist in the 60s and 70s, a lot of our discussions with workers was about trying to convince them that they may have the material advantages of capitalism, but how narrow their life was. Today, you don't have any worker you talk to will tell you that capitalism is sick. You don't have to convince them that capitalism is bad. The question is, what can you do about it? So this movement that emerged with Corbyn and Sanders had a whole new generation that was creative, committed, had energy, and alongside Sanders and Corbyn, opened up all kinds of new spaces, modified the discourse, and yet now it's quickly fading. And the danger is that fading and whether we can save it somehow. And the problems were in part that a lot of it, the people in it were looking for shortcuts rather than what and fading away. It's led to some people retreating to local organizing again, and it's retreated to divisions. I shouldn't say retreated to, but divisions are emerging between people who want to work inside the Democratic or Labor parties and people who criticize that and say you have to stay outside. So what can we do in this context to address all of this? What can we concretely do at a moment in time when the movement is relatively weak, the labor movement in particular is weak, when any of the movements that have emerged, with some people seeing them as replacing the labor movement, have, as Aaron said, turned out to be episodic, localized, sporadic. I think that a starting point is that we have to come up with a small number of strategic national campaigns. And the first reason for that is there was an infrastructure built through the DSA and through Momentum. We absolutely have to maintain that infrastructure. And we can't maintain it just by saying it should be maintained. We have to engage in struggles, engage in campaigns that continue those links, that continue to build the analysis, that continue to strengthen whatever organizational structures there were, and that continue to do the kind of popular messaging that organizations like Jacobin and the DSA and Momentum were doing. Second of all, it's important to have national campaigns because as crucial as it is to keep having our feet in local campaigns, in local movements. That's absolutely crucial. But that'll just leave us with a fragmented movement. To overcome that fragmentation, we have to have national perspective through national campaigns. The third thing is that these national campaigns address the threat of sectarianism. There's no point in us having a debate between whether to stay in or outside the party. I shouldn't say there's no point. The debate should continue as an ongoing thing, but we shouldn't divide ourselves about whether we should be in or out. There are going to be people who are good socialists who will be in and other good socialists who will be out. We have to have some humility about experimentation, about trying to figure out what is best, because people staying outside have never proven that they can build the kind of movement we need from the outside, and neither have people who went in. So what do? The point of the joint campaigns is, first of all, it's a check on social democratization, which is always a threat. That staying inside these parties means that you get trapped into small battles and you lose sight of, or you get too busy with the small battles to engage in what needs to be done on a larger scale. What engaging in campaigns does is it highlights the daily contradictions between the Democratic or Labor Party and socialists, even as we work with them. The other thing we need, the reason for why we need to do this is because there's going to be a split in the Democrats and in the Labor Party. And we have to be prepared for that split. Most likely we'll be kicked out. And we have to build a kind of base inside and outside so that when we get kicked out, we're not just left with fading away. And finally, it's because the prime question is, how do we build the working class? How do we establish connections with the working class? And we have to deal with that in terms of the limits that we have at this moment in time, whether we're inside or outside, and use these campaigns to overcome that limit. Now that leads to the question about, well, what kind of campaigns are we talking about? They have to be strategic campaigns. They have to address people's everyday needs. You can't organize without addressing people's needs. They have to represent reforms, but somehow through their very nature, they have to pose these larger questions. And I want to flag three things that I think have a lot of potential. The first is taking on the question of wealth taxes, whether they're emergency wealth taxes to deal with the outcome of the pandemic or the environment, or just a general argument for the redistribution radical redistribution of taxes. Now, this isn't a radical demand, I want to stress. This is a populist demand. The reason for it is it just keeps the question of inequality on the agenda. We will get changes in taxes from Biden, but they will be modest. Emphasizing radical tax redistribution is a populist way of keeping inequality on the agenda. And it's also a way of preempting the moment when they start saying we can't have these social programs or we can't afford paying public sector workers decently because we don't have the money. It starts putting on the agenda the fact as well, there is a way of getting the funds for that on the agenda by correcting what has happened for so long. The second thing we have to think about is something that I don't think the left thinks about enough at all. It often thinks about class and class power, but it rarely thinks about the context in which that's taking place, which is competition. As long as capital is free to move, as long as the dynamics of the economy are based on competition, that is always going to shrink the impact of anything we can win. We need to deal with this question of competition. And what we need to do is create spaces that have a logic other than competition. Now, what can those spaces be? First of all, and most obviously, there's the environment. It is not difficult to make the argument that we cannot solve the problems of the environment by leaving it to fragmented corporations competing with each other to see who can make the most profit. The environment forces some discussion, creates an opening for the left to have a discussion on planning. You need to plan, and you can't plan unless you control what you're planning. So it raises the question of challenging property rights. And the point of planning isn't just technical planning, it's to address needs, the kind of needs we need in terms of addressing the environment. And the scale of what's needed is immense. It isn't just on the margins of society. If we're going to address the environment and climate change, we're going to have to fix everything, change everything about how we live, work, how we move, transportation, etc. So it raises large questions in this planning thing. It also raises the kind of institutional changes we need in the state in terms of what Steve was raising. We need to have a convergence agency that thinks about supporting conversion, whether it's conversion that we're planning for from the top, or whether it's people responding to restructuring at the local level, because in every community, things are going to be closed. That's always restructuring taking place under capitalism. And we have to argue that they shouldn't be closed, that we need that productive capacity. We need to put it to other use. And that's the only way we're actually going to engage workers, as opposed to slogans that say we need a just transition, when that just sounds like something abstract that we don't have the power to do. So we need to talk about national convergence agencies. We have to talk about regional technical hubs that hire hundreds, if not thousands, of new young engineers. And this is something that emerges out of the COVID experience. We need conversion so we can actually make the kind of equipment we need. And I'll get back to this in a second with my second point. The second point is we already have a significant amount of the economy that deals with public services. The trouble is that in a capitalist society, there's always pressure to commercialize them, not just to privatize them, but to run them on a commercial basis in terms of the services, which leads to defective services, but also in terms of how we treat workers, or to restructure them so we can later commercialize them. We have to insist that they're public services. We want them to be run as public services. We want to extend them. We not only want universal health care in the States, but we want to talk about pharmacare. We want to talk about producing the kinds of things we need, the medical equipment and the drugs. So there's this whole agenda around public services. And again, we have to get on the agenda, not just that we want more, but the kind of public services. We want to democratize them so that people really support them rather than see them as agencies for policing them, agencies for managing them. We have to think about creating links between the workers in those sectors and the people that they are supposed to be servicing so that they can jointly talk about improving that service. And the third thing we have to talk about is this question of finance. Now, we're not strong enough to say we should nationalize finance. Obviously, we should. Finance is treated like a public utility whenever there's a crisis. and we should take it over as a public utility, but we're not strong enough. We have to think about what are the steps to get there. And we don't even have the capacity. We don't even know how to run finance, even if we had it. What we need is public banks. And by public banks, it could be a green bank, it could be infrastructure bank. But the point about it is, again, it cannot operate within the sphere of competition. We can't say we're forming a public bank and then it's going to go and compete for funds and then allocate the funds so it can pay off the interest it's paying. They need to be financed by a levy. We need to put a levy on every financial institution in the country, and that levy will be given to these public banks so they don't have to compete with them. And then the banks will have to find democratic means locally and centrally with new democratic structures that address how should we allocate them to address social needs, especially with the around the environment. The third kind of policy we need gets back to strengthening the working class, and a lot of this has been discussed in terms of new legal frameworks for unionization. But what I want to stress about this is the legal elements of this will not save us. The weakness of the working class, Canada has unionization rates 2.5 times that of the United States. In a lot of ways, we don't even have the energy that has emerged in the United States, or the creativity, as limited as that has been even in the United States. The question of organizing the class is fundamental. The question of transforming unions, so we're not just talking about expanding the kind of unions we've had and which have been so weak that we've ended up with things like globalization or neoliberalism or conservative policies. They didn't just happen. They happened because we weren't strong enough to block them. To address the question of unions, this really gets to the question of class. And when I say class, I mean it in terms of what Aaron was raising. I mean it in the broadest sense. What we've lost, even where there used to be communities of class, that has disappeared. And getting it back and building new class cultures is going to take time. So we have to be organizing in the community. We have to be bargaining in different ways that actually brings in the community and is about deepening participation, not just about some people bargaining for the whole members and then presenting them with the final collective agreement. It has to involve, everything we do has to not only increase participation, but deepen participation. We have to develop an ability inside unions to talk about internationalism and free trade. I'll get back to this, but it's kind of stunning the extent to which the American socialists stayed away from discussing free trade because they were worried that by criticizing it, they might sound like Trump. Whereas in fact, what was called for was them expressing it in class terms so that workers themselves wouldn't express it in chauvinist terms, but by expressing it in class terms, in terms of imposing limits on corporations, democratic limits, you could begin to do that kind of education and building. It's not just a question of saying we need to raise working class consciousness. We really have to address the inequalities within the working class. You cannot talk and sell the idea of class being the fundamental category we want to organize around unless you also say every member of that class has to be qualitatively equal. And by qualitatively equal, I mean that we fight actively. We don't just have a slogan, but we fight actively for their equality. We have to start thinking about building cadre schools. And this doesn't have to wait until we have a party. One of the things that was possible after Sanders was defeated was that there were tens of thousands of people who were supporting Sanders in every major city. We should have been forming organizations in every community. We should have been forming cadre schools in every community that taught people political economy. We should have been telling people that the question of class isn't just ideological. If you really want to think through how to reform unions, if you want to think through how to win, if you want to think through how to organize, you have to think in class terms. It's a practical question. And we also have to say that if you really want to win, you have to understand what you're fighting. And that means talking about the political economy of capitalism. That doesn't necessarily lead you to socialism, but it creates a space within unions for unions being what Leo once dreamt about in terms of unions being schools for socialism. If not schools, at least spaces where you could do that. And one of the exciting things in terms of paying tribute to Leo is that Momentum has now started a school in honor of Leo to develop leadership around the question of socialism and organizing. And then, of course, we have to think about doing popular education because the class doesn't just exist in unions. So we have to be involved in local struggles. We have to think about this in cultural terms. We have to think about the large campaigns. We have to think about all the frustrations that exist and the vacuum that exists in answering them, because they aren't solved right now or addressed even either through most unions or through political institutions. We have to think about organic leaders and, as Megan said, cultivating the capacities of organic leaders. Now, one of the problems is that there are people who are doing this, and Jane McAlevey is a very good example, but this can't happen just by individuals doing it, and it can't even happen by cloning some of these people. What we need is some systematic way of doing this. Now, that was always the role of a party, a space which reproduced our memories, where we could strategize, which was a place where we could learn, we could get a sense of what was happening everywhere. It was that kind of a space to counter the kind of power that the state gives to capitalists as a class. And without that space, we're limited. But in the context of not having that space and doing the kind of proto-activities, proto-state activity, we need to find ways of creating those kinds of structures, because it's only out of those structures that we can imagine a state, a counter party emerging. So let me just conclude. One of the questions we're going to have to face as socialists is that when you come to governance, there is a contradiction within the party itself between the pressures to govern, because you're still governing in a capitalist society, and the need to build a base outside the party. And this was one of the contradictions that Syriza faced, because what inevitably happens is that the section of the party that is in government has the authority of having been elected. It has the resources of the state, and therefore that carries it very far in disagreements about whether you should be spending more time building outside the party and putting pressure on your own party in the state, and even making it uncomfortable for them. And in terms of the question that was asked of Michal about Leo and his criticisms at the time of, or defense of Syriza, one of the points was that the left, or perhaps the ultra-left in Syriza at that time, was criticizing Tsipras in parliament for policies that weren't radical enough, but that wasn't the problem. The problem was that the party wasn't spending enough time building the base outside the party. And this was a critique of the ultra-left as well. When we asked the solidarity movements outside the party what was happening, what kind of support were they getting from the far left that was critical of Tsipras, what they told us was they weren't there. And part of the reason of defending Tsipras, although I think Leo was always critical and defending him, was not to reduce everything to criticizing individuals. It was to step back and ask, what are the larger issues that are going on here? And just quickly, I can't avoid saying something about it, but the referendum was itself misleading. The referendum didn't ask whether you're ready to leave Europe, because the reality that everybody knew in Greece at the time was the population had never been prepared to leave Europe. It wasn't ready to leave Europe and was opposed to leaving Europe. The referendum was only about challenging neoliberalism. And the truth was, and the truth should have been told, and in my mind, the truth should have been told even if it risked losing an election, which was that if you wanted to take on neoliberalism, you had to risk the possibility of losing an election. That's another thing. But what I do want to emphasize, inclusion, getting back to the class question, is we have to see the class question not just in terms of the outside pressures, not just in terms of the individual pressures on workers, but in terms of really transforming the labor movement as a whole. We need a revolution inside the union movement, and that is only going to happen through the support of people who have their feet inside the labor movement, but also outside. And in raising this, the movements are important, but the movements can't replace this. So this is a moment when, we can have all kinds of debates about what we'll do in government and how we'll try to transform the state. But the only thing that makes those debates relevant is if we can show that we can build a working class that is a real social force, that's a coherent social force with its own independent vision, that has the capacities and the strategic understanding that can take on capitalism, that can debate things democratically without becoming divisive internally. And that also has supplementary organizations that we don't talk about enough, such as regional assemblies of workers, which might stand between unions and a party as a way of developing skills and developing the kind of skills so that leaders have the confidence to go into a party and actually challenge party leaders who usually have the time and the education and the inclination to be much more confident and make it hard to argue with them. So if we can't deal with building this kind of a social force, then winning elections ends up being limited and leads to defeats. We end up not being able to transform the state. And that includes transforming unions so that when we come to power, their idea of transforming the state isn't just that they can have higher wages. It's actually rethinking what their new role is. And so questions of elections are still important, they're vital, but they're all vital in terms of thinking about how they relate to building the class. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Lots of great proposals really on the table in terms of what's next. But let me table that for now and we'll come back to it. I'll allow the panelists to actually respond to the ideas that Sam put on the table for further discussion. So let's give the floor to Barbara. Barbara? You're muted, Barbara.
Okay, now I think you can hear me?
Yes.
Good. Okay. Well, first, I would like to thank Greg and Sam and others for putting in the work to call all of us together. It's very nice to see everybody. It's nice to have the sense that the network that we've been part of for years still exists. And to see old friends that I haven't seen for a long time. And of course, it's also very painful to not have Leo here. But hopefully we can move on from that. I want to start by telling a story about Leo. The first time I met Leo, not in person, but over the phone, was, I think it was 1998 or maybe 1999. I was in New York for the summer and I got a call from Leo, who had somehow found out that I was in New York, inviting me to join the Socialist Register Collective. And I said I would be delighted to do that. And he asked me what I was doing in New York. I live in the Bay Area. And I said, well, I'm studying Yiddish. And Leo said, studying Yiddish, what a great idea, he said. We should publish the Register in Yiddish. A dead idea in a dead language, what could be better? And the thing that struck me about that was that obviously Leo didn't mean it. But there was something about that kind of a way of acknowledging setbacks with a kind of self-deprecating humor that seemed to me to make it possible to laugh and move on. And it made me feel comfortable about being part of Socialist Register, that one could acknowledge defeats and deal with them, and not be stopped by them. Anyway, I also wanted to affirm both what Arun said in the last session about the absence of organizations on the left in the United States and the dreadful effects that has in a period when people are suffering so badly. And Sam's comments about the need for a party. And if there's anything I want to say, it has to do with those issues, the need for organizations and for a party, and also the need to look at some large issues directly, even if we don't have the answers to them. I want to start with a reference to an article in the 2020 issue of the Register by Leo and Sam and Steve Mayer, in which they pointed out that the Bolshevik Revolution is finally behind us. Young socialist activists, they wrote, are today far more likely to be inspired by elements of the original revolutionary spirit than its specifically revolutionary methods. And they pointed out, in reference to the growth of both the DSA and Momentum in Britain, that there are rapidly growing numbers of young people who consider themselves socialists and who are not thinking about Bolshevism. And they went on to argue, of course, that there's also the trap of social democracy and that creating social programs is not enough if capitalism and corporate power are left intact, because as we know, corporate power will grow and will smash those social programs. Well, what I want to begin with is to talk a little bit about the movement or the left arena, whatever one wants to call it, in the Bay Area, some of its strengths and weaknesses, and particularly among young people in DSA and elsewhere. The authors of the article, Leo and the others, are absolutely right that the Bolshevik Revolution is no longer the first, or for that matter, the second, third, or fourth thing that anyone thinks of, or that young people in particular think of when the issue of socialism comes up. This is also, I would say, the case in left liberal public discourse, at least in the Bay Area and probably elsewhere. And it seems to me to be a very important breakthrough, that it is now finally possible to talk about socialism without first having to convince one's audience that one is not talking about placing a dictator in power. It's been taken a long time. This is the question of the attitude towards young people and people drawn towards socialism, towards social democracy, I think is more complicated. The waves of young people joined DSA during Sanders' campaign and proudly call themselves socialists. But my impression, and I, by the way, rejoined DSA at that time, so I went to meetings of young people just joining DSA, and I heard them talk about why they were drawn to socialism. And my impression was that for many of them, socialism at that time did not mean more than a sort of updated version of the New Deal, including environmental change. That wasn't true of everybody, but it was true of a lot of people. I think that has, and that was true, by the way, among my students, my undergraduate students at UC Santa Cruz as well. I think that has changed. I think that the pandemic, which in in some ways has affected that generation particularly harshly, with people who had jobs no longer having those jobs, with what they thought of as economic security crumbling, have begun to have a deeper sense of the problems of capitalism and of the need for something that would go beyond social welfare programs. And also, as Leo and the other two said, an appreciation of the need for struggle within political parties, which was traditionally, as they said in their article, has been abhorred by socialists. So I would say that the good news is that there is now in the United States, particularly in the Bay Area, but I think this is true in many places, inside and outside DSA, a generation of young people who have had a very intense experience of interracial activism, in large part through the Black Lives Matter movement, and who are committed to building a non-racist, egalitarian society, and who associate, for many of whom this is associated with socialism, and who will continue to be a major part of a movement for progressive social change, in which, for many, socialism will constitute a kind of guiding principle. I think the fact that the recent movement has been interracial is grounds for optimism about the character of movements in coming years. I also think that the concept of socialism remains vague, and that is completely understandable because there are so many urgent issues to address that discussing and debating what exactly socialism means is, for young people, young activists in particular, not a high priority. Well, having said that, I also think that there are some problems that I want to mention. One has to do with the severe paucity of large-scale activist membership movement organizations of the left in the United States. We just don't have them anymore, and many people don't seem to even think in those terms. This is true of the Black Lives Matter movement, which has not resulted in, despite the massiveness of that movement and the intensity of it, it has not resulted in such an organization or organizations. In the Bay Area, I think that the role of the nonprofits in organizing and leading those demonstrations has had something to do with it, because leaders of nonprofits were not thinking about forming a large membership organization. But I also think that this is true not only of the Black Lives Matter movement, but it is really almost universally true in the United States. We simply do not have the organizations that we once had. And for the reasons that Sam talked about, this is really a crisis. Now, this is not to underestimate the impact of the Black Lives Matter movement on attitudes towards race and racism, on the election of progressive candidates, and on a shift to the left in the Democratic Party, all of which are very hopeful things. But in order to continue this impact and the potential impact of the wave of interest in socialism, large-scale organizations with clear and conceivably achievable programs are absolutely necessary. Well, there are other problems as well. There is a wave of sanctimony that has spread through left and left liberal circles in the Bay Area, and I think elsewhere. Examples of it, two public examples of it, have been a campaign to paint over a New Deal era mural done by a communist criticizing slavery and the murder of Native Americans, by portraying instances of both. A campaign to rename 44 San Francisco high schools, including those named after Washington, Jefferson, and Abraham Lincoln on grounds that they were all racists, and a sort of trend towards condemnations of fellow activists for using the wrong word, having the wrong attitude, thinking the wrong thoughts. All of these have become routine in the Bay Area. And my point here is that a purity campaign is not a good way of building a movement. I sometimes think that the reason for this is that people are feeling sort of powerless. And if we can't change anything else, we can change the words people use and the thoughts that they may have. There is, however, a third problem, which is much larger. And it seems to me that, well, it's clear that there are three issues that threaten to transform our lives in ways that we absolutely do not want. And I think that there is, in the case of two of them, there is less attention to these than might be the case on the left. And one of them, I think, is more acute in the United States than elsewhere. The first of those three issues that we face, these three devastating possibilities, the first is the environmental crisis. And at least in regard to the environmental crisis, there's now widespread acknowledgement of it and discussion about it, and also activism in relation to it. That doesn't solve it, but at least it's on the table. The other two are the danger of nuclear war and the, particularly in the United States, the danger of the advent of a kind of neo-fascism. In relation to the danger of nuclear war, I am surprised that there's less talk about this because nuclear weapons have spread throughout the world. There are, I was involved, my first involvement in the movement in the late 50s and early 60s was through the peace movement. When we were protesting the development of nuclear weapons and testing of nuclear weapons. There are many times more nuclear weapons scattered around the world than was the case then. We talked about the danger of nuclear war then, including the danger of accidental nuclear war. I think that that danger is much greater now than it was then. I also think that while Biden obviously has done much better in domestic policy than many of us anticipated, his foreign policy is a disaster, and that there is the danger of a war between the United States and China, which could become nuclear. The next danger is that of the possibility of fascism, the possibility of something that would look like neo-fascism, particularly in the United States. I know that many people don't like to use the word fascism. It's been overused on the left. I used to react against it because I thought that it was mostly a way of expressing anger rather than an actual analytical term. I changed my mind about that with the election of Trump. It seems to me that the difference between authoritarianism and fascism is that fascism means not only authoritarian rule, but also a policy of setting either a majority against a minority, mobilizing a majority against a minority, often but not always a racial minority, possibly an attempt to set a half of the population against the other half of the population, an affiliation with violent right-wing groups, and also the invention of an imagined history of a time when the people who are depicted as causing all the trouble weren't present, and a call for returning to that, that pure original history. Now, all of these things, I think, go beyond authoritarianism. And I think all of them are characteristics of the Republican Party and make the possible ascendance of the Republican Party in the United States a real danger. And I think what's happened in the United States is that many people, including people on the left, are so relieved not to have Trump in office anymore that it's easy to put this danger aside. But I think that could be a mistake. So at any rate, I think it would be, I think that along with the importance of forming mass organizations and thinking even in I don't know whether we think about a party in the United States, but we can certainly think about organizations that can represent the left and put pressure on the electoral arena. I think that goes along with trying to address these major issues as well as holding out the aim of socialism, of a democratic form of socialism.
Thank you, Barbara.
I lost track of the time. I don't know whether I've gone over or under.
So both of you, Sam and Barbara, you've gone over, but I think we have a little bit of flex time towards the end, just so we may cut into the break. But I think all of the comments, Barbara, were most welcome and important. So I couldn't even begin to think of cutting you off, especially when you were talking about the nuclear dangers we are facing. How do you limit that point? Anyway, if the other panelists don't mind, at this point, I was going to let Trevor and Minqi speak, but I think it's better for Bhaskar to take the floor, particularly given his involvement politically in the US, and much of the last two conversations were about that. And I think it would be a good for us in terms of the lineage of this discussion to have Bhaskar go. So if it's okay with you, Trevor and Minqi, I know I had planned to have you next, but if that's okay, I'll let Bhaskar take the floor.
All right, well, thank you for putting this together. And I'm very pleased, especially about Left Forum's involvement, because I feel like for a lot of us in the US and the New York area, seeing Leo was one of our highlights of Left Forum. And I can't say where I'd be politically and intellectually without Leo. I, in a sense, met Leo long before he met me through reading Socialist Register and his books, like Working Class Politics and Crisis. This, I always used to tell him, was my favorite of his collections, because I feel like it hasn't gotten quite the attention of some of his other works, but I personally found it incredibly useful. And I think for those of us who rejected Leninism, at least as it has developed, but also who saw the trajectory of social democracy as a dead end, Leo's work was really indispensable, and we gravitated towards him. Then obviously, eventually I was able to really meet Leo, and I think it was in 2011, and I was just around 22 or 23 years old. I remember his patience, his warmth, and for then on, I would seek him out in part because of his ideas, in part because he was someone who, I guess one way to describe it is, he would debate and disagree with you and tell you quite openly how he thought you were wrong about any particular thing, but you would leave the conversation feeling better about your capacity to think, maybe not better about your particular ideas on any given point, but your capacity to think than before the conversation. And I think that was a credit to his personality. I think it's a credit to the skills he developed over the years as a teacher. I was able to go up to York University, see him at least briefly in his natural environment, and then see how many people I think had that relationship with him, and how many people he was able to shape, which quite beautiful. It did make me feel less special, but it was beautiful to see. I also had the pleasure of catching a few Blue Jays games with him, and I never took him up on one of his jazz club invitations because I didn't really have the air for it, to my everlasting regret. But I did. I associate now the Blue Jays, and I think he would be very happy about how badly the Yankees are doing with Leo. So I can't speak better than any of the other speakers, especially Sam, to Leo's political and intellectual work and his thoughts on social strategy going forward. I think I'll keep my comments very short. I just want to comment on a rare combination of his orthodoxy, in the sense of his faith in the traditional goals of the socialist project, and the creativity in which he approached those goals, and the challenges that have emerged while pursuing them. So it never felt like a knee-jerk orthodoxy, and it never felt like one that wasn't complicated. And I should say that I use the word orthodoxy in the sense of his project being very much centered around a few things. And I think one is the idea that our project today is one of class reformation, which implies a central role for the working class as an agent of change, but it highlights rather than neglects the difficulties of that process and our need for new tactical routes to achieve it. So it wasn't just a propagandistic point where you just repeat at the end of every line or piece of propaganda that working class agency is what's needed. But also, on the other hand, it still took very seriously the old Marxist idea that there was something special about the working class and its position in a capitalist economy that gives it unique leverage to make change. So I think he knew, in other words, how much things had changed since the socialist critique of social democracy in the mold of Socialist Register, in the mold of figures like his mentor, Ralph Miliband, since that time. So if you could transport yourself back into the late 60s and early 70s in a place like Italy, if you went to a working class area, you would know it. It would have a lot of people disproportionately employed in the same industries, or at least it'd be maybe a dominant industry. There would be a certain set of civil organizations that would very much have a class coloration to it. You could tell it in manner of speech and dress, and maybe in this area disproportionately they would vote for the communists, they'd vote for the socialists. But as radicals, we could say they're voting for parties that are programmatically committed to the goal of socialism. And they're a group of people who are broadly class conscious and that they see themselves as workers, and they're structurally positioned at key nodes in the capitalist economy. And then our goal is to convince them to pursue these same paths of class consciousness and organization, but pursue maybe the road of rupture to get there quicker, or at least push against the conservative and bureaucratic impulses of certain traditions and embrace a different sort of politics. And obviously now we're in a very different environment. We have to rebuild working class civil society itself, or civil society as a whole. And it's easy to take those conclusions and see how far we've fallen, and then to just simply mourn the old reformist left organizations. But I think Leo had a different view of things, which is both highlighting the key role of the political party in cohering together this agent of change, the working class, while not neglecting the danger of bureaucratization and reformism, which was rooted not in personal vice, but in a structural condition. The structural pressures that come with administrating the capitalist state. But he did this without downplaying the culpability in political leadership of these parties and not pursuing alternative routes out of the structural dilemma of social democracy. So we often used to, I think sometimes with Sam too, talk about the interview that Leo did with Meidner, or at least that was published with Meidner in Socialist Register in 93 or 94 about Sweden's failed wage earner fund as the high point of social democratic radicalization in the 70s. It pointed to democratic socialism potentially, and more importantly, pointed to the fact that social democracy, social democratic parties became moved to the right, moderated, and were forces of reformism, but they didn't necessarily mean that the rank and file of organizations like the LO or even SAP itself had to go down those routes. And third, I say orthodox because I think he, in his worldview, was the key role of the state in socialist reform, but the need to not just wield, but transform the state. So I also think, like Sam, that it was interesting how focused Leo was on things like the grassroots solidarity networks that emerged in Greece, even though the ideological roots of at least some of those networks were more anarchist than traditionally socialist. That's also why his critique of Syriza was focused on their inability to embolden those actors when in state power, rather than this or that tactical choice in the question of the Eurozone. I don't want to repeat my thoughts there. I think Sam captured them well. Leo, of course, was opposed in the abstract to the Eurozone, but I think that the thrust of his criticism of Syriza was around the fact that they, like other social democratic parties, didn't embolden an extra parliamentary left when in power, and that's the kind of thinking about the new sort of social democracy that we would want to have, which is one that doesn't pursue the old route, but that immediately democratizes the state, or pursues those routes and encourages participatory organs, and looks very different than the arc of 20th century social democracy, one that more naturally pointed to a socialism beyond social democracy. So I'll leave it more or less there. You know, I really look forward to every chat that I had with Leo. Even in his last months, I think he was very optimistic about his next few years of projects and things. I had a certain research agenda this year, which was to nag him a lot about his faith in the feasibility of wide-scale planning. You know, we had some chats about my recent work on that subject, and on Sam's recent pieces on market socialism and some of these debates. So I do really rue how much he had left to give us and offer us and the left in our political project. Obviously, I should end on an optimistic work, saying that we will continue his work as best we can. I'm certainly, you know, very happy to see so many people commemorating Leo's achievements, commemorating what he gave to the world, what he gave to us personally, how he brought us together. But the loss is truly immense, and it's not something we'll easily get over at any level. But I'm so grateful that we have this opportunity to talk a little bit about his life and work.
Thank you, Bhaskar. In the rush we were in the last transition, I forgot to introduce Bhaskar Sankara, although he needs no introduction. He is the founding editor and publisher of Jacobin, and also the publisher of Catalyst, and the author of which I think most of you have, which is the Socialist Manifesto, The Case for Radical Politics in the Era of Extreme Inequality. So thank you for that, Bhaskar. And let me next go to Trevor. It is getting quite late for him probably by now, probably 9:30 in South Africa. Trevor Naguani is a scholar, activist who spent 20 years as a full-time organizer in South African trade unions, community organizations, and social movements before, and after the defeat of the apartheid. He's a lecturer now in sociology at the University of Johannesburg and director of the Center for Sociological Research and Practice. He's the author of Amakamati. No, sorry, I knew I was going to blow that. Amakamati. And you can correct me, Grassroots Democracy in South Africa and Shacks and Settlements. Welcome, Trevor.
Thank you very much. It's really an honor for me to be on this platform. Comrade Leo Panitch was a great comrade, a scholar activist, and a revolutionary thinker. I met him in Cuba about 15 years ago, where we were gathered for a conference on Marxist ideas. The main contact there was Comrade Marta Haneke and her partner Michael Lebowitz. There was also Isvan Mezaros and other Marxist greats. I was there with Patrick Bond and David Masondo from South Africa. I was impressed with Comrade Leo, witty, always ready to laugh, politically forthright and sharp. Castro was around at the time and he attended one session of the conference where he ended up speaking for 6 hours, cutting into our tea time and postponing our dinner. Still, it was great. I again met Comrade Leo in Venezuela much later for the 21st Century Socialism project, where there was still Hugo Chavez. Chavez also did a Castro speaking for hours on end. And I have not found any explanation in any of Comrade Leo or Sam Gindin's writings on why, these comrades were doing this. So in a webinar hosted by comrades Vishwa Sadka and Michelle Williams here in South Africa, commemorating Leo Panitch's life, Sam Gindin gave input in which he summarized Leo's work under 3 headings: the state, the working class, and the party. So in my talk, I will use these headings to talk about the South African political situation in the light of Leo Panitch's work. Firstly, the everyday life of workers in South Africa, their living conditions, the living conditions of the ordinary person in post-apartheid society. This is an issue which was at the heart of Leo's politics and scholarship. Later, I'll comment on the political condition of the working class, the mood of the class, and the state of its organizations. Since our national independence, the everyday life of ordinary people has not improved much in South Africa. The COVID-19 crisis only served to highlight and underline the poverty, unemployment, and inequality in the country. In 2018, the World Bank declared South Africa the most unequal society in the world. Unemployment only last week was officially announced to be at 32%. Unemployment among the youth is estimated at 63%. The working class is not enjoying a safe, efficient, and clean energy. There are regular power failures called load shedding, which disproportionately affect poor working class areas such as Soweto, Orange Farm, and the rural villages of South Africa. There's an area, for example, in Soweto called Sun Valley in Pimville, where residents have not had electricity for 9 months, with the state doing nothing to help them. A major reason for the electricity crisis in South Africa is misled neoliberal policy. For example, the ANC government refused to build new power stations because at that time it wanted business partners to buy in and take over electricity provision. This neoliberal approach has had disastrous consequences for the working class, with thousands of jobs lost by the government-owned electricity company, Eskom. Working class communities were terrorized by electricity cutoffs as people struggled to keep up with the exponentially rising electricity price increases. The second reason for the electricity crisis in South Africa is corruption. In South Africa, we have something called accelerated primitive accumulation, with the aspirant black bourgeoisie and sections of the upwardly mobile black middle class desperately trying to become rich. This ethos of self-enrichment articulates with the idea that liberation must bring economic prosperity to black people. However, with white monopoly capital still in full control of its stolen assets, the black bourgeoisie looked to the state to make its fortunes. There are above and below board deals, shortcuts, stealing, looting, and plunder of state coffers to make themselves rich. Corruption is such a big problem that daily on TV we watch what is called the Zondo Commission on State Capture. This is a commission looking into corruption, which is chaired by the country's Deputy Chief Justice. The worst part so ordinary people have to watch daily how the money is being stolen. It has been going on for the past 3 years, the Zondo soap opera. The worst part of the whole sorry business is that while the revelations continue on TV, the stealing and looting has not stopped. Since COVID-19, there are now scandals about contracts involving PPE, personal protection equipment, contracts which are irregular, overpricing, insider information, PPE which doesn't meet minimum requirements, etc. The Minister of Health, Zweli Mkhize, is involved recently, is involved in shady deals whereby there are companies which are milking his Department of Health. Meanwhile, many healthcare workers continue to find themselves at the forefront of the fight against COVID-19, but without adequate protection or their needs being met. There's still shortage of PPE, they still don't get a living wage, and especially the home caregivers, they are particularly underpaid. The health system in South Africa is a two-tier system split into public and private, with the majority of resources, human and material, serving the private sector, the rich. The government's vaccination program is slow, phlegmatic. The program to vaccinate healthcare workers has been a shambles. And of course, on top of this, there is vaccine nationalism, where the state is struggling to get enough vaccines at the required rate, fast rate. So we have dedicated healthcare workers who, despite their effort, find that they do not have enough to take care of the sick and fight the virus. They themselves are not protected, and many have died. Now, to turn to the state, Leo Panitch would have told us the root of the crisis of the working class in South Africa is because the state is a capitalist state. The ANC, African National Congress, the party of Nelson Mandela, is a capitalist party, a bourgeois party. As such, the party and the state, their first and foremost goal is to serve the interests of the capitalist class. Of course, they cannot simply ignore the working class, and concessions are necessary, but at the heart of government policy in South Africa is keeping the money bags happy. This is clearly illustrated by the issue of corruption, the issue of state capture. Yes, corruption is a bad thing, but profiteering is also a bad thing. The workers' movement must be mobilized to fight and root corruption and profiteering. Corruption must be exposed, profiteering must be exposed, But the public sector is not just the public sector. It is the public sector under capitalism, corrupted, commodified, commercialized. The public sector has been turned into a center of distribution of public money to private pockets, some of it as crude corruption, some of it as profit. How can it be that it is fine for anyone, anywhere, at any time to make profits because someone else needs health care? Bourgeois morality denounces some forms of corruption. It is not fine to steal by grabbing the handbag of an old lady. It is fine to steal through ownership of private property. It is fine that millions die because they are denied medical care. It is fine when millions are denied electricity because they cannot pay. It is fine, but it is not fine when corruption starts to mean profits are being lost, when the capitalist law and order is being undermined. At that point, corruption becomes a crisis. So how much time are they going to spend discussing who is capturing the state in that commission? The capitalists do not need to capture the state because it is not just a state standing outside of history and politics. It is a capitalist state. They have already captured it. The only argument in the capitalist state is only about who is in charge of this and who is in charge of that. Who gets this and who gets that? The crisis is not about government. It is a crisis about how to manage the real crisis of everyday life, the real crisis of profits, how to impose the costs of that onto the working class and maintain law and order. Leo emphasized, as we have heard from Comrade Sam Gindin, the importance of state power, the need for the working class to orientate itself politically towards the state. But some militants can take refuge in the space of civil society or the new social movements. It is important and legitimate to do so, but the power will remain untouched unless it is confronted. This is not to say, as some would have it, a preoccupation with state power. It is an encounter with the reality of everyday working class life. The issue of power cannot be sidestepped. To do that is to leave it to be answered by someone else. Some left tendencies argue the opposite. They pretend that there can be a power created which can develop outside and untouched by the power of the capitalist state. But to do so is to reinforce the power of the capitalist class. In South Africa, we're grappling with the legacy of demobilization. Sidestepping the power of the capitalist state helps the ideologized protection of capital. Capital has a totalizing vision. It provides both the vision and the materiality in lived experience to ground and validate its vision. That vision is that there is no alternative. There can never be a working class takeover of state power. There can never be a working class totalizing vision. There can never be an alternative to capitalism. State repression is a reality. We saw that in the Marikana massacre on 16 August 2012, when 34 miners were shot dead by the police. The miners were striking for a living wage. The ANC government does not hesitate to use rubber bullets and live ammunition against working class communities who are protesting and fighting for their basic needs. So every day there is evidence of an old truth. Bourgeois democracy is the most that capitalism can offer, and the most is itself not very democratic. Now, I want to end off by talking about the party and the working class. Leo wrote about the necessity of a party of the working class. in South Africa, we have the South African Communist Party, the SACP, which claimed vanguard status as leader of the struggle of workers over decades in the struggle against apartheid and into the post-apartheid era. The SACP claimed victory when apartheid was defeated, but the continuities of oppression and exploitation in South Africa beg many questions about the SACP's theory, strategy, and tactics. The South African Revolution, like almost all societies that experienced colonialism, had to theorize its approach to two key questions, the national question and the social question. That is the struggle for national independence, and with us, it was a struggle against the apartheid regime, and the struggle for socialism, which was the struggle to end the rule of white monopoly capital and its dominance of the mines, the factories, the banks, and the farms, the struggle to end the exploitation of labor. The SACP came up with its theory of two stages, whereby the resolution of the national question became a precondition for the struggle for socialism. Today, we find that South Africa is trapped in stage one, whereby bourgeois democracy is creating new obstacles to the transition to socialism. We see the emergence of the black bourgeoisie, the self-enrichment of the middle classes, class collaboration and business unionism in the trade unions, demobilization of the mass movement, and crisis of the working class in their everyday life. We see the loss of the role of the workers' movement as a center of authority for the broader mass movement. We have a workers' movement without a center of authority in organized labor. So bourgeois democracy in the new South Africa has not delivered the goods. The rich are still getting richer, the poor poorer. The everyday life of ordinary working class people is a nightmare. Housing, water, electricity, healthcare, jobs, education, everything. The needs of the working class are not met. There is no comfortable life for the masses. The masses are not protected. Yes. So given this situation, the crisis of the working class in South Africa, the real question is, what would a revolutionary communist party do? We see working class communities fighting for water, electricity, students fighting for free education. When they do so, they find themselves coming up against the ANC government, the capitalist state. And when they do, many will look for a revolutionary communist party to stand with them in that struggle. Instead, they will find the SACP, and they will find an SACP which is not a revolutionary communist party. Instead, they'll come up against a Cyril Ramaphosa, the new president of the ANC, against an ANC government supported, protected, and defended by the SACP leadership. What would a revolutionary communist party do in this situation? It would make it clear that it will refuse any seat in a boss's government. A revolutionary communist party would campaign for a public sector solution to the electricity crisis. It would campaign to make sure that the heart of that solution is not the government, not the officials, not management, but the workers who provide the service in alliance with the working class people who need and depend on that service. A revolutionary communist party would recognize in addressing the COVID-19 crisis that the health workers are already providing healthcare to the masses. But they are using a healthcare system that is dysfunctional, that is designed to serve the rich. A revolutionary communist party would make sure that the knowledge of the healthcare workers is recognized, acknowledged, and properly rewarded. They must get a living wage. They must be protected when carrying out their duties. The carers must be cared for, and the health workers must lead the struggle for healthcare because they are the producers of healthcare. A revolutionary Communist Party would campaign for recognition and respect for those whose hands do the work, for the producers, those who produce life's necessities, those who alone can bring the strength and collectivism to challenge capitalism, to destroy it and replace it. And with that recognition comes a correctly formulated strategic question in the struggle for everyone. What can workers do, and what can we do to support the workers? So, comrades, to conclude, because I've been going on and on, one of my major points is that among workers in their daily lives, in their struggles, there is creativity, compassion, intellectual life, and humane relations. So this is what we have to recognize. And it is upon these qualities of the working class in their everyday life that is contained the vision of the future. The vision of the future, the alternative, is already embodied in the struggle of the working class in the present, in collective solidarity, which is the soul of the workers' movement. So South Africa is a country full of protests and strikes. You know, at one point it was called the protest capital of the world. Of course, that was before the Arab Spring and the Occupy movement. But during all those protests, they are fragmented. They are not united. And there is never a suggestion of regime change, of getting rid of the ANC government, of getting rid of the capitalist government and replacing it with people's power, with workers' power. It's almost as if the ANC government, the bourgeois state, will always rule. The bourgeoisie will always be in power. So this is a challenge for having a revolutionary Communist Party in South Africa. Today, the ground is shifting. The capitalist system is making life absolutely unbearable for the working class. The stories about corruption are irreparably damaging the ANC. There is a sense among ordinary people, among workers, even among sections of the middle class, that things cannot continue in the same way. Local organs are rising up in the townships. Although the politics is still fragmented, inward-looking, and particular, solving each neighborhood's problems, there is a driving necessity to be organized as people realize that they are standing on their own. For example, they have to organize themselves against the escalating crime, which is wrecking communities apart. They have to organize themselves and cope with the electricity power failures collectively rather than as individuals. A lot of this happens through social media, but some of it involves physical meetings and collective action. And when this is happening, it is based upon the history and memories of local organizing which happened during the anti-apartheid struggle. The street committees, the yard committees, the shop steward committees, the civics. So the ground is fertile for a structured organization that can provide a collective and unifying vehicle to channel all this rebellious energy, all this creative energy, which is searching for solutions, the yearning for something different. The ground is fertile for a revolutionary Communist Party in South Africa. The possibilities are there. Of course, there are also the obstacles. So I would say that with healthcare, for example, if you are fighting for healthcare, the answer is socialism directly. There are people and resources who can meet the healthcare needs of the masses. They can be better trained, they can be developed. All of this can be planned. All of this can be done as long as there is no profit in it. There is no need for profit. There is no place for profit in serving the healthcare needs of the masses. All that is required is workers meeting the needs of other workers. It just needs power, a workers' government, a workers' plan, workers' control. None of this should involve profit. I think Leo Panitch, with his comrade Sam Gindin, dedicated his whole life into strengthening the struggle of the working class. The best way to honor Comrade Panitch's life is for us, the living, to take forward his work by joining workers and all the world's oppressed and exploited. Join them at the barricades of everyday life. Organize, mobilize, and fight for another world, a world where everyday life is made bearable and comfortable for all. Such a world can only be a socialist world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Comrade Trevor. Now, our next guest is very well timed, given the conversations going on about Tiananmen Square in China and the commemoration of it. And so our next guest is Minqi Li, who is a Chinese political economist, world system analyst, a historical social scientist, and currently professor of economics at the University of Utah. Minqi Li is known as an advocate of the Chinese New Left and as a Marxian economist. He's the author of Profit Accumulation. I thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Sharmini, thank you for your introduction. It's good to see everyone here, and I will try to be short, and I understand we are kind of over time, right? And then I'm honored to be on this panel to celebrate the life and achievement of Leo Panitch as a great intellectual, as well as a revolutionary. And then during my years, I spent 3 years at the York University. So during my years over there, Leo was one of my great friends, also a mentor and also a comrade. I and Leo share the same political perspective, and we are both committed to the building of better, more sustainable, more equitable, and a socialist future where the workers of the world can freely develop themselves. And of course, I and Leo also have some minor disagreements, and just minor disagreements. And being Marxist, and we are all familiar with Marx's argument in the Communist Manifesto that the workers of the world would one day become the grave diggers of capitalism. Now, as a matter of fact, the workers of the world have not yet become the grave diggers of capitalism. So why is that? There are, of course, many different possible answers. If you are a defender of the existing capitalist system, you might argue that after all, despite whatever have happened, capitalism has delivered material prosperity, if not to everyone in the world, at least to the perhaps the majority of the population in the developed part of the capitalist world system. And then you could argue that despite all the limitations, despite even evils of the capitalist system, it's still the best among all possible systems that could exist on this earth. Or you could argue that the Marxists have failed to raise the consciousness of the working class, have failed to convince the workers that their long-term interest lies with some form of revolution transformation beyond the existing system, rather than trying to have a better life within the system. And so Sam earlier also talked about the question about how to overcome this fragmentation of the working class. Or you could take the argument from Lenin, what Lenin argued in Imperialism. And where Lenin argued that in the era of imperialism, the capitalist class in the imperialist countries could exploit not only their domestic working class, but also the peoples of the colonies. By exploiting the peoples of the colonies, the capitalists in the imperialist countries could appropriate the super profits. And then they could use a portion of these super profits to buy off section of the working class, what Lenin referred to as the labor aristocracy. And that, according to Lenin, constitutes the material foundation of the Second International Revisionism or social democratic politics or some form of class compromise within the imperialist countries. Later, by the mid-20th century, we have got the world system theory, which would argue that this imperialist exploitation is not just limited to super profits or transnational corporate investment. It also takes a form of unequal exchange between the peripheral and the core part of the capitalist world system. So in other words, the peripheral countries would export commodities that embody comparatively more labor time than the labor time embodied in the commodities exported by the core countries. So for several decades after World War II, the working classes in the Western capitalist country did enjoy unprecedented improvement in material living standards, as well as a reasonably stable liberal democratic political system. But if you look at this from the ecological perspective, you could argue that all of that economic growth as well as improvement in material consumption has been based on the massive consumption of fossil fuels, especially cheap oil. But this consumption of fossil fuels eventually will lead to conditions that would destroy the global ecological systems and therefore destroy the material foundation of human civilization. So if we look at today's world, the global average temperature is about 1.2 currently, about 1.2 degrees Celsius higher than the pre-industrial time. And then even though the governments of the world, corporations, various official international organizations continue to pretend they are committed to preventing global warming to no more than 1.5 degrees. But for all practical purposes, if you look at the current pace of global warming, the global temperature basically is rising at the rate of between 0.2 and 0.25 degrees per decade. So we could surpass this 1.5 degree threshold in the next 1 or 2 decades. So for all practical purposes, even if we have, say, global eco-socialist revolution tomorrow, unfortunately, this 1.5 degree objective is no longer attainable. The best we can hope for right now is to limit global warming to no more than 2 degrees by the end of this century. That will not rule out some of the climate catastrophes, but hopefully it will buy humanity some time, and so that we can better adapt to the future conditions and then have some time to work towards a more sustainable future. But even if, say, the objective is to limit global warming to no more than 2 degrees, that probably is incompatible with further economic growth in at least the more developed part of the capitalist world system. But on the other hand, zero or negative economic growth, of course, would be incompatible with economic and the political stability within the capitalist system. On the other hand, we have got neoliberalism. And we know that in the neoliberal era, the Western working classes have suffered historical defeat. But as a part of a strategy for the capitalist class to defeat the working class in Western Europe and North America, they have relocated a large portion of the production industry to new areas with large cheap labor force, especially China and the rest of Asia. Now, from the capitalist point of view, this relocation would help to expand the global reserve army of labor, to undermine the power struggle on the part of Western working classes. But in the long run, this relocation has also created a large new working class in China. And now we have entered into a new period where this Chinese working class begins to raise economic and political demands that can no longer be accommodated by the current regime of Chinese capitalism. So earlier, Barbara made the very interesting observation. So now we have a new generation of young people in the West that become attracted by the socialist ideas, but without too much influence from Bolshevism. But I can testify that Bolshevism is still very much alive among the Chinese left, especially among the young Chinese left today. And so you could actually argue that the main debate among the Chinese leftists these days take the form of the debate between those more Leninist-oriented leftists and those more Maoist-oriented leftists. So whatever is the form, and the Chinese, fair to say that the Chinese left today is much more influenced by the international communist tradition than the post-1968 new left tradition. And then on the other hand, China's economic rise has contributed to the redistribution of global wealth that has undermined the historical relationship of unequal exchange. That is perhaps a factor that has contributed to this gradual collapse of the historical social compromise established in the Western capital countries. So as Leo predicted several years earlier, that the contradictions of neoliberalism would eventually radicalize the working classes in different parts of the world. That will in turn destroy neoliberalism itself. The only question is which sector of the international working class will take the lead in the coming struggle, and whether the workers of the world will bury capitalism before capitalism destroy the material foundation of human civilization. So I will just stop right here.
All right. Well, I think we have about roughly 5 minutes left to take questions and also to have a break before the next session starts. I'm wondering first, let me give an opportunity for the panelists themselves. If you have questions of each other, and if so, you can just unmute yourself and pipe in. Any questions? Sam, I'm wondering.
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
No, there's obviously not a lot of time to get into things, but in terms of learning something about China, I'm wondering if we could hear about what organizational forms are emerging from the working class in China. To what extent, are they linking each other? Are there links forming across workplaces, for example, or in particular regions of the country?
Well, given the Chinese political condition, of course, whatever organization form cannot take the formal form. Right? So, but my understanding is that there are many practical circles, small groups that exist in different parts of the country, and that could be used as an effective tool of struggle in the Chinese context.
Thank you.
Minqi, I'm wondering what your take might be on what is going on throughout the Chinese diaspora in terms of the protests that we've been seeing both in Hong Kong as well as in commemorating the Tiananmen Square massacre.
We could spend an entirely new panel to discuss about this, and but just very quickly, let me just put it this way: the current Chinese progressive movement has gone beyond the generation of 1989, and now they are challenging the capitalism itself.
Any other questions? All right, then I think we're going to have to wrap up this panel, and I'm so saddened by that because I feel so many really brilliant ideas were put on the table to think about, for all of us to think about it, and to also chart a new course forward. So stay tuned. I think we'll come back to you. One of the, after spending so many years going to the left forums, people often leave going, oh my God, so many great things were said. How do we follow up? Hopefully, we will be able to do that in a similar forum. And let me converse with the organizers of this panel and the Left Forum and the Socialist Register, who has sponsored this conference today. And we'll get back to you by email. So I thank you all for joining us and sharing your most celebrated moments with Leo Panitch and his theories, ideas, and his politics. Thank you so much.
Thank you.